Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Amokwariola. Once upon a time, many centuries ago, history tells a familiar story of oppression and the Israelite migration from Egypt across the Sinai Desert to the Promised Land. Fast forward to 2005, when thousands of East Africans began to modern-day exodus from Egypt to Israel, and you have accounts of Eritreans and Sudanese who fear their safety as asylum seekers and refugees in the country could be over. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on plans by Israeli government to deport illegal African migrants? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report now, and Africa Today will be right back. Welcome on board.
Israel's announcement of its latest migrant policy is a hot topic in the nation, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu facing pressure from his nationalist voter base to expel the migrants. Now more than 30,000 African migrants will have to find new homes. Rights groups advocating on their behalf say many fled abuse and war, and that the expulsion would further endanger them.
These are people arriving from Eritrea and from Sudan, two countries that are known to be committing human rights violations, committing torture. These people deserve international protection. They deserve international protection in Israel as well.
Netanyahu insists the migrants were being sent to a safe destination and that he agreed with Rwanda's President Paul Kagame to only accept relocation of migrants within the limits of international law. But Eritrean Afewerki Kidani says he would rather be thrown in jail than take $3,500 cash offer to hop on the plane back to Africa from the outskirts of Tel Aviv, where he has lived for the past 9 years.
I will choose. It's not a choice, but I will force her to be in prison if they decide, because at least I will stay alive in the prison.
Those countries are not secure for me. I came here to save my life. So what I choose now is to stay in prison.
Rabbis, survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, and ordinary people are also against the deportation plan. They want Israel to show greater compassion towards the migrants.
There is a law, but there's also something that is over that law. There's the moral call. I am ready to do whatever I can do and go as far as I can go to show that this is not the Jewish thing to do, it's not the human thing to do.
The deportation plan gives young male migrants with no family in Israel a choice to either take the cash and leave to a third African country. But women, children and men with families in Israel were to stay for now, as was anyone with outstanding asylum requests.
The new Israeli deportation policy offers African migrants $3,500 and a free air ticket to return home or go to a more stable African country, with Rwanda and Uganda being touted as possible destinations. Now, more than 20,000 migrants have been expelled, and now the mission is to get some 38,000 migrants living illegally in Israel and about 1,000 refugees held in 2 detention centers in the country. Well, joining me in the studio on Africa Today, I have Liberos Oshoma, lawyer and a political analyst. And on Skype, I have Collins Iweke, Nigerian migrant and a politician based in Belgium. Good to have you, gentlemen, on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Right, let me begin with you now, Liberos. Let's look at the deportation plan of the Israeli government. It's not only deporting Africans here, but also plans to, give them $3,500 and a free air ticket to a destination which is either Rwanda or Uganda. What are your thoughts on the arrangement put forward by the Israeli government on this matter?
Let me start on a very funny note. If $3,500 and an air ticket were the problems of these migrants, they probably wouldn't have been in Israel today. The problem is much more than that. And I salute the the cooperation of the citizens in Israel, you'll find out that most of them, majority of them, apart from a few, majority of them are not in support of this decision by the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Most especially also, they want Israeli to remember where they're coming from, the history. Apart from the fact that they're originally migrant, apart from the fact also that they were instrumental to the signing of the asylum protection treaty. They also want Israel to remember where they're coming from, from the Exodus movement from Egypt down to the Holocaust, and then today I think most of these, it's not a fault of the Israeli government that African has not been able to take care of its own, and the crisis in Africa is there. But these people also deserve protections. The people deserve pity. You can from 2012, when the Israeli government built the great walls to protect their borders, the migration from Sudan and Eritrea has also reduced. And so these people were running away. Majority of them were running away from their countries, not necessarily for lack of $3,500, but because they want to leave. And so some of these that have found themselves in this country, I think the government can do much more, far better than just asking them to come take.
All right, let me quickly come to Colin Tuweke. With the position put forward by Liberal Soshoma, the government of Israel says that it is strained already because the country is a small state. So adopting or taking in about 37,000 illegal migrants will be too much for the government. Do you think, what are your thoughts rather on the government's position on this?
That excuse by the Israeli government is complete nonsense. It is nonsense because I believe what we are seeing here is a right-wing government that is completely bereft of compassion, that has no sense of history. Because if they do have a sense of history, like my colleague in the studio mentioned, and as aptly captured in your introduction, it would have been very clear to them how they became a nation state. Now, like it has been mentioned, $3,500 is insufficient to buy the conscience of an individual who is running away from persecution in his or her country. Now, if you add that to the fact that there is supposed to be an international protection for these individuals, and we are unsure that these rights of these individuals have been exhaustively explored and their rights given to them, and the Israeli government is signing this despicable deal with some disgraceful African government. I mean, you just ask yourself, where is the world going to? Where are we heading for? Because this is simply unacceptable. And so the long and short of my point here is that the excuse that they are being overwhelmed by migrants and the country is too tiny to absorb them is completely, unacceptable.
So you think the government doesn't have an obligation to its citizens here in Israel because that's its primary concern, to protect its people than migrants?
The government of Israel, indeed, first and foremost, has obligations towards their citizens, but in equal measure, they also have international obligations that they signed. They are signatories to different accords, including the Geneva Convention, that clearly states, and I mean, this is an obligation. They signed up for it, and they can decide at any point to, pull out of the Geneva Convention agreement, but until they pull out, they are expected to honor the lines and the spirit of that convention, which means that when individuals are fleeing persecution as refugees, their case must be exhaustively looked at. That's number one. If for any reason that these people were not accepted, Now, there is also the provision for a safe country status for the people. So on humanitarian grounds, they could be allowed to stay and all of that. So yes, their obligation towards their people is not in contradiction with their obligation towards the international community and indeed those fleeing persecution. Both of them can go hand in hand.
All right, let me hold your thought for now. We need to go on a very quick break. You're watching Africa Today, and we've been looking at plans by Israel for illegal African migrants deportation. Stay with us for more discussions in a bit. Welcome back. In recent times, the echoes of history grew louder following reports that some Holocaust survivors wrote to the Israeli Prime Minister asking to halt their deportations and also offered to shelter African refugees. Now, at the heart of the dispute is how Israel, founded as a home for persecuted Jews, would integrate newcomers while preserving its Jewish character as a signatory to International Convention on Refugees in 1951. Now, let's look at the moral justification of this Israel deportation. Activists, well, to some extent, say it's not proper because Israel was once a sanctuary for Jewish refugees, during the Holocaust and all of that. But if you to take this into account of what they've done, for instance, some families in Israel have decided to take some refugees in, pending the time, they have an asylum their documents, and everything in place. But how much do you think they can offer? How much help or how much assistance do you think they can offer to the large number of refugees in Israel, knowing that they are not just 1,000, 2,000, but 37,000 illegal migrants?
That's to tell you that the resilience of the people, they are ready to protect. They see the government sees them as migrants, but they see them as fellow humans, who are undergoing what, some of them or some of their parents had undergone, during the Holocaust. And so they wouldn't want, it also would bring memories of what they went through. And, with the cries and the complaint by the people, it should be enough for the government to take a back seat and say, look, wait a minute, we need to review this decision. But gradually, anyway, the complaint and the demonstrations of the people also is gradually getting to the government. And that's why, recently the Prime Minister had said that the deportation will only apply to, African single men and will not apply to the women and children, 5,000 children. And then also, it will not apply to men who have filed in for asylum, who filed in for asylum as of January 1st this year. And so, if you look at, let's even look at the indices, do the mathematics of it. You say Israel is a small country and you don't have enough space to take these migrants, and yet you have enough prisons to keep them. You say, okay, it's either you take the $3,500 and a ticket, go back, or we'll begin to arrest you. And some of them, like one of the migrant that was interviewed in during your intro, did say, look, they are ready to go to prison rather than go back, because if they go back to where they're coming from, they are really not sure of what they're going to face
what the
there.
future holds.
And so it shouldn't just be about Israelis alone. I think also the international community should, also lend its voice to what is happening in Israel, because it is African migrants today. Only God knows where the next boat will be and who it will happen to. So to that extent, and then also I want to use this opportunity to call on African leaders to begin to look inward, because there's been this consistent message that the solution to African problem lies in Africa. And so your citizens would not be leaving your countries in droves. I agree. Yes, some left their countries as a result of war and a crisis. But then look at, one of the migrant also that was interviewed during the crisis did say that they were heading towards Libya, but they were abandoned at the desert until they were welcomed by the Israeli soldiers who welcomed them with food and water. That showed the passion, the compassion that the average Israeli have towards migrants. And then coupled with the recent slave trade that was discovered in Libya, which shows that Africa is a hotbed for people who want to flee because of the suffering, and day in, day out, you see Africans dying in droves in the Mediterranean Sea.
Which is a very worrying point you've raised here, because you're talking about migrants, you're talking about Africans living in droves, leaving their continent for greener pastures outside the shores of their own continent. How can we prevent this, this influx? Because it seems like it's going to go on unabated.
You need to look at leadership in Africa. You need to look at poverty eradication. You need to also look at education in Africa. People ordinarily want to live free. People want to live peacefully. But if you live in a crisis-torn country where there's so much poverty, you would naturally want to gravitate towards where the pasture is greener. And so this is why you have citizens from African countries wanting to just cross the Mediterranean Sea, not minding whether those countries are even better than the ones they are coming from. You see Nigerians, you see Ghanaians, you see Cameroonians living in droves, wanting to cross over to Europe, wanting to cross over to some of these Arab countries. African leaders, it is high time African leaders need to sit down to stem the tide of this migration. And the only way you can do that is to begin to diversify, not just agriculture, diversify into education. The world is gradually growing into a knowledge-based economy. And so you need also to give your people education to be able to eradicate poverty. Until they do that, they're still going to, this is just a tip of the iceberg.
So
and the
we'll
world at the point Africans would want to naturally migrate into Europe.
All right, colleagues, let me quickly come to you now. As a migrant, I'll be more direct in this question. Is the pasture actually greener on the other side where you are?
Well, it depends on what, from the perspective you are looking at it. Of course, there are some opportunities out here in the West that Africa does not, offer to young people. But at the same time, there are opportunities in Africa as well that individuals need to explore. To know that you definitely do not need to migrate in order to make it in life. I believe that what a lot of people find out when they eventually migrate, to the Western world, is that life is not the bed of roses that they may have imagined. As a matter of fact, you probably need to work 4 times harder out here, in the diaspora, to make your living, to make your life palatable, than you would need to do back in Africa. But you see, People don't realize that until they come. So ultimately, I think what I would say is that it is not so much a question of your location. I think it is more a question of the individuals. But I should as well add that the major difference between survival and making life out here in Europe or the Western world as opposed to Africa is that you have purposeful governments here that create perspectives and create opportunities for hardworking people to thrive. I wish I could say the same about Africa. Unfortunately, that is not the case. I mean, if you allow me a little latitude, I could talk about the EU Trust Fund for African Migration, which the European Union actually established about a year or two ago. We are talking of some 2 billion euros, which was made free for African governments to put up projects to create employment and opportunities for young people, the same, demographic that actually migrate en masse to Europe, so that opportunities are created for them back in Africa, so that the tide of migration will be curbed. That is the pull factor, the reason that people want to leave Africa, risk their life and come over to Europe, so that they will stop the problem right from the source. Now, what are we getting? A country like Nigeria, for example, did not even bother to look at the application to put up a project. I mean, what Kagame and other African leaders, Uganda and so on and so forth, may have actually come up with is this despicable, deal that they have signed with Israel. So the point here is that African leaders need to wake up and think in the best interest of their young men and women.
Now, looking at this holistically, let me come to you now, liberals. Looking at this matter holistically, how can we resolve this? Because you've mentioned leadership and everything that has a role to play, so that we can have our continent for ourselves and Africans living in it as well. But how can we resolve this? What other role do you think the international community can do in this regard? Let me call in the African Union in this matter now.
Not
what
just
can
the African
they do?
Union.
In this
not
matter?
enough. It's not enough to have a pool of funds for African to draw from to stem migration. Also, there's need for the Western world to help stem corruption in Africa, because most of the funds stolen from Africa find safe havens in some of these countries, wherein they now take a little and give back to Africa as grants or as loan or as pool to stem migration. And so it's not something that started today. It's a fallout of a long history of corruption, encouraged also by the lackadaisical attitude of the Western leaders towards the thievery, permit me to use that word, perpetrated by the African leaders. And so also, apart from those funds, there's need also to begin to help stem the tide of Africans stealing and going to keep these funds outside. Use these funds to provide opportunities, infrastructures, education, eradicate poverty in your continent. And so that will help, to provide opportunities for these young people. Most of them also, permit me to quickly say that most of them they know that it is not greener on the other side, but they are just looking for opportunities for a reward. Because when there are opportunities for reward, like my colleague has said, you work and you see the benefit. Infrastructures are there, but when you have a young graduate who, when he gets a job, his pay can hardly take him home, and in most cases, you graduate, there are no job opportunities, and then they tell you, think not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that young, uneducated man who finds himself in politics, so much amassed, so much for himself. And then that your younger brother who traveled abroad some years back came back looking, all robust. And in spite of the fact that he's a vulcanizer, wherever he is. You think, oh, look,
he's making it over
I
there.
can do this same, if I can do this same vulcanizing job and just get that little reward, I think it's better for me there. You know, so we need to find a way, the international community need to help find a way to channeling, you know, some of these funds. And then African Union shouldn't just be a union of slogans and resolutions.
Yeah.
Because so far, African Union, they are, for like a few years back now, you know, they come together at a round table, discuss, pass resolutions, and at the end of the day, ends there until the next, you know, meeting. You know, the regional communities are even doing better. And so I think they should also find a way, tell themselves the truth, and find a way of standing this tide, because nobody would help us the way you would help yourself.
Indeed, and I like that positive note right there, Liberos Oshoma. Thank you very much for all you've said on the program. As well, Collins Weke, thank you very much indeed for your contributions on Africa Today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
In a continent where people would rather be slaves abroad than be free at home, the disturbing cause of migration is a wake-up call for African leaders whose actions and inactions ensure that a tipping point is never too far away. While longer-term solutions for migration are imperative, short-term measures must be well thought out to end the politics of hunger, address the economics of survival, and deliver the sustainable development to every nation of Africa, one person at a time. And that is our package for today. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG, and follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one, I am Esther Makwariola, and always remember, this is Africa. Bye for now.